At 75, Henry Thompson finally pursued his lifelong dream, learning mathematics. But the moment he stepped into the classroom, he realized he wasn't welcome. The professor saw him as nothing more than a joke, an old man clinging to an impossible dream. Then, in front of everyone, he issued a cruel challenge, certain it would break Henry. The room fell silent. Henry stood up, walked to the board, and what happened next left everyone speechless. Want to know what happened? Watch until the end for a story filled with emotions and shocking twists. Comment your city below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Henry Thompson had spent most of his life in the background. He was the man who kept things running, the one who never complained, never asked for more. At 75 years old, he had worked nearly every kind of job you could imagine. Factory worker, janitor, handyman. He had built a life, provided for his family, and done everything a good man was supposed to do. But now, for the first time, Henry found himself alone. His children had grown up and moved away, busy with families of their own. His beloved wife, Margaret, the woman who had been his anchor for over 50 years, had passed away just 2 years before. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that made the walls feel like they were closing in. One evening, while sitting at his small kitchen table, Henry pulled out an old, worn notebook. Inside, faded pencil marks filled the pages, numbers, equations, little scribbles, in the margins. It was from decades ago, from a time when he had once dreamed of something more, mathematics. He had always loved numbers, always felt a strange kind of comfort in solving problems, finding patterns where others saw chaos. As a boy, he had spent hours filling notebooks with equations, reading textbooks far beyond his grade level. Her professor had once called him a genius, a prodigy, but then life had gotten in the way. His father had fallen ill when Henry was just 17. With no one else to support the family, he had left school and gone to work. That full-ride scholarship to university. He never even got to respond to the letter. His hands, meant for chalk and numbers, had instead learned to lift heavy boxes, scrub floors, and fix broken machines. Now, sitting in the dim light of his kitchen, he traced a trembling finger over the old pages. A thought flickered in his mind, one that felt impossible at first, even foolish, but it wouldn't go away. What if he tried again? What if, after all these years, he finally learned what he had always wanted to? The very next morning, Henry walked into the local community college. His heart pounded as he filled out the enrollment form. His hands, wrinkled with time, gripped the pen tightly as he wrote his name beneath the words, "Evening Mathematics Course." Henry stood in front of the classroom door, gripping the strap of his old leather satchel. He had bought it decades ago when he still believed he might one day go to college. Now, at 75, he finally was. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The room was filled with young students, teenagers and 20-somethings in hoodies, tapping on their phones, chatting in low voices. No one noticed him at first. He found a seat in the back, carefully placing his notebook on the desk. Then the murmurs started. A few students glanced his way, nudging their friends. A girl whispered something, and a boy stifled a chuckle. Henry pretended not to notice, his fingers resting on the edge of his notebook. Then the door swung open. Professor Andrew Whitman strode in, a tall man in his 40s with a sharp suit and sharper eyes. He was known for his ruthless teaching style, the kind of professor who took pride in making students feel small. He didn't believe in patience, only in results. As he scanned the room, his gaze landed on Henry. Whitman's lips curled into a smirk. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole class to hear, "looks like someone took a wrong turn on their way to bingo night." Laughter rippled through the students. Henry felt the heat rise to his cheeks, but he kept his face steady. He had spent a lifetime swallowing his pride. He wasn't about to let a few chuckles shake him now. Ignoring the laughter, he opened his notebook. Whitman continued, pacing at the front of the class. "Mathematics," he said, "is not for the faint of heart. It's not something you try. It's something you either master or fail." His eyes flicked toward Henry again. "And some people," he added, "should know their limits." More laughter. Henry gripped his pencil, pressing it against the paper so hard the tip snapped. Maybe coming here was a mistake. Maybe he really was too old. But then, somewhere deep inside him, something stirred. A memory, a feeling, like the boy he once was. The one who had dreamed in numbers and equations. He looked up, meeting Whitman's gaze. "I'm here to learn," Henry said, his voice steady. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Whitman shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, turning back to the board. Henry exhaled. He was staying. For better or worse, he was staying. The first few weeks were harder than Henry had imagined. It wasn't just the math. It was the way people looked at him. Every time he raised his hand, Whitman would sigh dramatically before calling on him. If Henry asked a question, the professor would give a curt, dismissive answer, often followed by a sarcastic remark. "Did they even teach algebra back in your day?" he joked once, making the class chuckle. Henry swallowed his frustration. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to learn. But learning felt impossible in an environment like this. The students didn't take him seriously either. Some whispered behind his back. Others smirked whenever he struggled with a problem. One evening, while erasing the board after class, he overheard two students talking near. "The door, what's the point? He's like ancient." "I know, right? It's sad, like just enjoy retirement, man." Henry pretended not to hear, but he did, and it stung. Still, he kept showing up. Every evening, he walked into that classroom, sat in the same chair, and opened his notebook. When he didn't understand something, he stayed up late, going over the material again and again. His wrinkled hands shook sometimes as he wrote, but he kept going. One night, long after class had ended, he sat alone in his small kitchen, staring at a half-finished equation. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he wouldn't let himself quit. He had spent his whole life working hard for others. Now, for the first time, he was working hard for himself. Then came the night everything changed. Henry had been struggling with an assignment, one that Whitman had deliberately made extra difficult. As usual, when Henry tried to ask a question, the professor barely acknowledged him. Then, with a smirk, Whitman turned to the class. "Since Mr. Thompson is so eager to participate," he said, "let's give him a chance." He walked to the chalkboard and with dramatic flair wrote down an equation, a complex, near-impossible problem. "Go ahead," Whitman said, stepping aside. "Show us what you've got." The class snickered. Henry stared at the equation. For the first time, doubt crept in. Was this just another humiliation waiting to happen, or was this his moment? Slowly, he rose from his chair. The room fell into a hush as Henry took a step forward, picked up the chalk, and faced the board. The chalk felt strange between Henry's fingers, cool yet familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend after decades apart. Behind him, the students whispered, waiting for him to fumble, to fail. Whitman leaned against the desk, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his eyes. He had set this up to be a lesson, a warning to Henry and to the class. Some people didn't belong. Henry took a deep breath, then he started writing. At first, his movements were slow, hesitant. His mind raced through old memories, dusty knowledge that had been buried under years of hard labor and lost chances. But as the numbers and symbols began to unfold, something inside him woke up. His hand steadied. The logic came rushing back, not just the rules, but the way math had always made sense to him, the way it had always felt like a language he was meant to speak. The classroom grew silent. The whispers stopped. Students leaned forward, their smirks fading into wide-eyed astonishment. Whitman's smug expression shifted. He pushed off the desk, stepping closer. Henry moved faster now, each step of the solution flowing effortlessly into the next. His mind was clear, focused. The years melted away, and for the first time in decades, he felt young again. Not in body, but in purpose. The chalk danced in his hand. The final line appeared, then silence, a long, heavy silence. Henry stepped back, heart pounding. Whitman's face was pale. He scanned the board, searching for an error, some reason to dismiss what had just happened. There was none. Henry had solved it. Perfectly. A chair scraped against the floor as a student sat up straighter, blinking in disbelief. Another muttered, "No way," and then one person clapped, then another, and another, until the entire class was applauding. Whitman's jaw clenched. He turned away, masking his humiliation behind a forced cough. "Class dismissed," he muttered, hurrying. Out of the room. Henry stood there, chalk dust on his fingers, as the sound of applause filled the air. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just seen, he was respected. Henry walked home that night with a strange feeling in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years: pride. For so long, he had been invisible, a man whose work was noticed only when it wasn't done. But tonight, for the first time, people had looked at him with admiration instead of pity. What he didn't know was that his moment of triumph had not gone unnoticed. One of the students, a young woman named Lisa, had recorded everything. The equation, the stunned silence, the moment Henry turned the impossible into possible. She had uploaded it to social media with the caption, "75-year-old man walks into math class. Professor tries to humiliate him. He leaves everyone speechless." By the next morning, Henry's world would never be the same. Henry's morning routine had always been simple. Wake up early, make coffee, read the paper at the kitchen table where Margaret's chair still sat empty across from him, but today his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first he thought it was a mistake, some glitch in the old device his son had given him years ago. He barely used it except for calls from his kids and the occasional message, but the notifications kept coming. Then, a call. "Dad?" It was his daughter Emily, excitement in her voice. "Have you seen the internet today?" "The internet?" Henry frowned. "No, why?" She laughed. "You're famous." Henry blinked. "Famous? Check the video I sent you." After a few minutes of fumbling with his phone, he finally managed to open the link. His own face stared back at him from the screen. The video had millions of views. Millions. The comments were filled with words like inspiring, unbelievable, legend. People wanted to know who he was. Universities, journalists, and even mathematicians were reaching out, amazed by the story of a 75-year-old man who had walked into a classroom and left a seasoned professor speechless. Henry leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. For decades, the world had forgotten him. Now it was watching and waiting for what, he wasn't sure, but he was about to find out. The next few days felt like a dream. Henry's phone kept ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Universities wanted to recognize him. Mathematicians from around the world were analyzing the video, praising his technique, his clarity, his brilliance. Strangers sent messages of admiration. "You're proof that it's never too late to learn. My grandfather went back to school because of you. Professor Whitman must be eating his words." And Whitman? He hadn't said a thing. No response, no statement, just silence. Henry didn't care. He hadn't done this to humiliate anyone. He had done this for himself, but the past has a way of creeping back when you least expect it. One evening, Henry sat at his kitchen table, sipping his usual cup of tea, when his phone rang again. Another unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Pause. Then a voice he hadn't heard in over 50 years. "Henry, is it really you?" Henry's breath caught in his throat. The voice was older now, rougher, but still unmistakable. Dr. Raymond Ellis, a name Henry had tried to forget, a name tied to a life he had almost had. "You probably don't remember me," the man continued. "But many years ago I remember," Henry interrupted, gripping the phone tighter. "You were the professor who offered me a scholarship." A long silence, then a quiet sigh. "Yes, and I was also the one who never knew why you never came." Henry closed his eyes. How could he explain? How could he put into words what it had felt like to hold that acceptance letter in his hands, to see his future written out so clearly, only to have it snatched away by responsibility, by family, by life? "I wanted to," Henry finally said. "I just couldn't." Another pause. Then Dr. Ellis spoke again. "I never forgot you, Henry. I always wondered what happened to you. And now, here you are, reminding the world of the brilliance I saw in you all those years ago." Henry swallowed hard. His hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of what could have been. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Dr. Ellis chuckled softly. Then let me say it for you. A brief pause, then, the university wants to give you something you earned a long time ago. Henry's breath hitched. What do you mean? Come visit, Ellis said. We'll talk in person. And just like that, the past he had buried so long ago was rising to the surface, waiting for him. Henry stood at the gates of a place he had once only dreamed about. The university. Decades ago he had held an acceptance letter in his hands, imagining himself walking these very halls, studying under great minds, dedicating his life to numbers and equations. Now, at 75, he was finally here, not as a student, but as something else entirely. The moment he stepped onto campus, a wave of emotions hit him. Regret, hope, wonder. Would things have been different if he had taken that chance all those years ago? A young man in a suit greeted him with a warm handshake. Mr. Thompson, welcome. Dr. Ellis is waiting for you. Henry nodded, following him through the grand hallways. Students rushed past, carrying textbooks and laptops, engaged in deep conversations. He had once imagined himself among them. Finally, they entered a large auditorium, and Henry froze. The key. Room was packed. Students, professors, even reporters. The murmurs hushed as he stepped inside. Then at the front of the room stood Dr. Raymond Ellis, older now with silver hair and wise eyes, but still the same man who had once believed in him. Henry, Dr. Ellis said, stepping forward, you have no idea how long I've waited for this moment. Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. I never thought I'd be back here, Ellis smiled. You should have been here all along. Then he turned to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, today we correct a mistake. Decades ago, Henry Thompson was offered a full scholarship to this university, a scholarship he had to turn down, not because he lacked talent, but because life demanded something different from him. The crowd listened in silence, but talent like his never fades, and after all these years he has reminded the world of his brilliance. Ellis turned back to Henry, his voice thick with emotion. It is my honor to present you with something that has been rightfully yours for over 50 years. A young assistant stepped forward, holding a black folder with the university's emblem on the front. Dr. Ellis took it, then looked Henry in the eyes. A diploma. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Henry's hands trembled as he reached for it. His name, printed in gold. A degree in mathematics. An honorary recognition of the life he was meant to live. Applause erupted. Henry stood there overwhelmed, the weight of the moment settling deep in his chest. He had spent his whole life thinking this chapter had closed, but now, at 75, he realized some dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to come true. Henry sat in his kitchen, staring at the diploma on the table in front of him. It felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. But it was real. The gold lettering, the university's seal, his name written in bold, undeniable print. At 75 years old, he had finally earned what he had once thought was lost forever. His phone buzzed again. More messages, more calls. The world still wanted to hear his story. One news station called him the man who defied time. A university in Europe wanted him to speak at a conference. A group of mathematicians had even invited him to collaborate on research. It was overwhelming. And yet, none of it compared to what happened when he returned to class. 1 week after receiving his honorary degree, Henry walked into the evening math class just as he always had. The room was different now. The students, many of whom had once laughed at him, were silent when he entered. Not out of awkwardness, but out of respect. Then something incredible happened. One by one they stood up, and they applauded. Henry felt his throat tighten. He wasn't a man who had ever sought attention, but this wasn't just applause. It was recognition. It was understanding. Even Whitman was there, standing in the corner, arms crossed. His usual smugness was gone. Instead, he gave Henry a small, almost reluctant nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Henry took his seat, and for the first time since he had enrolled, he didn't feel out of place. The lesson began, but before the professor could start, a student raised his hand. Mr. Thompson, the young man said hesitantly, could you explain how you solved that equation? Henry blinked a pause. Then he smiled. He picked up his notebook and leaned forward. "All right," he said, "let's start from the beginning." The class listened. They took notes. And for the first time, Henry wasn't just a student. He was a teacher. A lifetime of hard work, of being overlooked, of sacrificing dreams for others. It had all led him here. And as he spoke, as he explained the beauty of numbers, he realized something. He hadn't just earned a degree. He had found his purpose, because it's never too late. Not to learn, not to chase a dream, and certainly not to prove, once and for all, that you belong. If this story moved you, if it made you believe, even for a second, that it's never too late to chase a dream, then you're exactly the kind of person we love having here. Subscribe to the channel and join us for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the strength, resilience, and unexpected twists life has to offer, because sometimes the best chapters come when we least expect them. Hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's next.